December 5, 1941. A collapsing barn 35 kilometers west of Moscow. Dr. Hinrich. Harper stands in the doorway, breath freezing into ice crystals before his face. He's a Wehrmacht medical officer. He's been awake for 36 hours. His hands won't stop shaking. Not from fear, from the cold that's burrowed into his bones and won't leave. He watches what remains of the 252nd Infantry Division stumble past through waist-deep snow. 6 months ago, these men crossed the Soviet border. With flags flying, 17,000 strong. Farm boys from Bavaria, factory workers from the Ruhr, confident they'd be home by Christmas, back to their families with stories of how they crushed the Red Army. In weeks, fewer than 4,000 can still walk. Their uniforms are gone, replaced by rags wrapped over stolen Russian coats. Their boots, those legendary German jack boots that marched across Europe, are disintegrating. Men shuffle past on feet wrapped in newspaper and cloth. Some are barefoot, their toes black with frostbite, leaving bloody prints in the snow. Their rifles are frozen solid, useless. Many have thrown them away. What's the point of carrying a weapon that won't fire? Their eyes are what stops Harpy's heart. Empty, hollow, staring at nothing. These aren't soldiers anymore. These are ghosts who haven't realized they're dead yet. Behind them, the eastern horizon glows orange. The Soviets are coming. T-34 tanks, engines roaring through the frozen night. Siberian divisions in white winter camouflage, moving like wolves through the forest. Fresh troops, warm, fed, armed. The Wehrmacht is running. For the first time since 1939, the German army, the force that shattered Poland in 4 weeks, that brought France to its knees in 6, that conquered half of Europe, is retreating in chaos. Hape has the casualty reports in his medical tent. Or he did before they burned everything they couldn't carry. The numbers carved into his memory. Over 800,000 German casualties in 6 months. Not all dead, though. Hundreds of thousands are. The rest wounded so badly they'll never fight again. Missing, swallowed by the Russian winter. Captured by the Red Army, incapacitated by frostbite so severe. Their feet and hands have turned black and fallen off. Broken by typhus and dysentery. Gone, removed from the fighting force, erased from the order of battle. 3.8 million men stormed into the Soviet Union on June 22, the largest invasion force in human history. They were told it would take 10 weeks, 12 at most. The Red Army would collapse. The Soviet Union would fall like a house built on sand. It's been 24 weeks and the Wehrmacht is disintegrating in the snow. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa. The story of how absolute confidence became absolute catastrophe. How the most powerful military machine ever assembled was broken not by a single battle, but by hubris, miscalculation, and an enemy that refused to quit. But before we go further, if this story matters to you, if understanding how empires collapse and hundreds of thousands die because leaders believe their own lies matters, hit the like button and drop a comment. It tells the algorithm that this history deserves to reach more people. Over 800,000 men lost in 6 months. They deserve to be remembered. More than that, they deserve to be understood. Because here's the truth most people don't know. It wasn't the winter that destroyed the Wehrmacht. The catastrophe was already unfolding in the summer heat, built into the plan from day one, driven by decisions made in Berlin by men who couldn't conceive they might be wrong. By the time the first snow fell, it was already too late. This is how it happened. To understand how over 800,000 men became casualties in 6 months, you have to go back to the room where the decision was made. Berlin, December 18, 1940. Adolf Hitler stands over a Massive map spread across the table in the Reich Chancellery. It's past midnight. Outside, snow falls on a city that's been at war for 16 months. Around the table, his top military commanders. General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittel, General Alfred Jodl. They've been summoned to hear the Führer's decision. Hitler's finger traces a line from Germany's eastern border deep into Soviet territory. Warsaw to Minsk, Minsk to Smolensk, Smolensk to Moscow. His hand doesn't stop at Moscow. It keeps moving east. Volga River, the Urals, into the vastness of Russia itself. Gentleman Hitler says Britain will not surrender because they believe the Soviet Union will eventually enter the war against us, destroy Russia, and Britain's last hope dies. They will negotiate. The room is silent. He continues, we will invade the Soviet Union in spring 1941. We will destroy the Red Army in a single campaign, 8 weeks, 10 at most, before autumn. Glances at the other officers. No one speaks. You don't interrupt the fora. But this isn't really about Britain. Everyone in this room knows it. This is about something Hitler has wanted since before he took power. Since the 1920s, when he wrote Mein Kampf in a prison cell and laid out his vision, Lebensraum, living space. Germany's destiny is in the East. The conquest of Soviet territory. The destruction of what he calls Jewish Bolshevism, the enslavement and extermination of the Slavic peoples, the colonization of Eastern Europe by German settlers, everything until now. Poland, France, the Low Countries has been preparation for this. The officers around the table have conquered Europe for him. In 18 months, the Wehrmacht has crushed 6 nations. Poland fell in 4 weeks, Denmark in 6 hours, Norway in 2 months, the Netherlands in 5 days, Belgium in 18 days. France, the great military power that held Germany to a stalemate for 4 years in World War I, collapsed in 6 weeks. The German military appears unstoppable. But Britain won't quit. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority over England. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, has been postponed indefinitely. The Royal Navy controls the seas. American industry is pouring weapons and supplies into Britain under Lend-Lease. Germany can't invade Britain. Britain won't negotiate. The war in the West has reached stalemate. Meanwhile, to the east, the Soviet Union grows stronger every month. Stalin is rebuilding the Red Army. Soviet factories are producing thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the 1939 non-aggression treaty, that shocked the world, was always temporary. Both sides know it. Hitler made his calculation. Strike now while the Red Army is still recovering from Stalin's purges. Wait, and the Soviets become too strong. On this December night, he makes it official. Within days, the order goes out. Führer Directive Number 21, Case Barbarossa. The directive is explicit. The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, even before the end of the war against England. Target date May 15, 1941. Objective: destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper and Dana rivers. Prevent Soviet forces from retreating into Russia's interior. Advance German lines to a boundary running from Archangel to Astrakhan, a line stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Caspian Sea. What remains of the Soviet Union beyond that line will be a broken shell incapable of resistance, ready for colonization. The planning begins immediately. German military intelligence, the ABV, compiles assessments of Soviets' military capability. The reports are damning. Stalin's purges destroyed the Red Army's leadership. In 1937 and 1938, Stalin, paranoid about military culottes, executed or imprisoned tens of thousands of Red Army officers. 3 of 5 Marshals executed. 13 of 15 army commanders executed. 8 of 9 admirals executed. 50 of 57 corps commanders executed. 154 of 186 division commanders executed or imprisoned. The officer corps has been decapitated. What remains a political loyalists promoted for ideological reliability, not military competence. The Red Army is led by yes-men and survivors, not professionals. Soviet performance in the Winter War proves their incompetence. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, a nation of 3.7 million people, with an army of over 425,000 troops. The Finns had roughly 300,000 soldiers, obsolete equipment, and limited armor. The war should have lasted weeks. Took the Soviets over 3 months and cost them between 126,000 to 167,000 killed, and 264,000 turned to 321,000 wounded. The Red Army looked incompetent, sending masses of troops into Finnish defenses in human wave attacks, suffering catastrophic losses, failing to coordinate infantry and armor. If tiny Finland could inflict that kind of damage on the Soviets, what could Germany do? Soviet equipment is obsolete. German intelligence reports that most Soviet tanks are inferior to German panzers. Most Soviet aircraft are outdated compared to the Luftwaffe. Soviet doctrine is primitive. Mass assaults, rigid adherence to orders, no flexibility. German training is superior. German officers have years of combat experience from Poland, France, and the Low Countries. German tactics, blitzkrieg, combined armor and air strikes, rapid encirclement have conquered Europe. The Soviet state is fragile. Forced collectivization has devastated the countryside. Millions died in the famines of the early 1930s, particularly in Ukraine. The population resents Stalin's regime. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Baltic peoples will welcome the Wehrmacht as liberators from communist oppression. The Soviet Union, German intelligence concludes, is a house of cards. 1 strong blow and it collapses. Nearly every assessment is either wrong or catastrophically oversimplified. But no one in German high command questions them. Why would they? These conclusions confirm what Nazi ideology already teaches. Slavs are inferior. Communism is weak. The Soviet Union is a rotting structure waiting to fall. In wargame exercises simulating the invasion, some officers raise concerns about logistics. The distances are enormous, over 1,000 kilometers to Moscow. Soviet infrastructure is primitive. Can the Wehrmacht sustain an advance that deep into Russia? They're told the campaign will be over before logistics become a critical problem, 8 to 10 weeks maximum. The Red Army will be destroyed in the border regions. After that, Soviet organized resistance evaporates. The objections are noted and dismissed. By spring 1941, the invasion plan is finalized. 3 army groups will strike simultaneously across an 1,800 m front. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Rita von Ebb, approximately 700,000 men, will drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Approximately 1.4 million men will smash through Belarusia towards Smolensk, then Moscow. This is the main blow, the hammer. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Approximately 1.2 million men will advance through Ukraine toward Kiev and the resource-rich Donbass industrial region. Total invasion force, over 3.8 million Axis troops, including German, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and other allied forces. 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 aircraft. This will be the largest military operation in human history. The strategy is Kesselschlag, cauldron battle. Panzer spearheads will punch deep into Soviet territory at multiple points, encircling entire Soviet armies in massive pockets. German infantry will then close the encirclements and destroy the trapped forces. The same tactic that annihilated Polish and French armies in weeks. The goal: destroy the bulk of the Red Army west of the Dnieper and Dana rivers within the first 3 to 4 weeks before Soviet forces can retreat into Russia's vast interior. After that, the campaign becomes a pursuit and occupation operation. The timeline begin in mid-May. Reach the Dnieper River by mid-June. Smolensk by mid-July, Moscow by late August, victory by October, well before winter sets in. It's a plan built on speed, overwhelming force, and the absolute conviction that the enemy will break quickly. In April 1941, that plan hits an unexpected delay. Yugoslavia's government, which had agreed to join the Axis alliance, is overthrown in a military coup on March 27. The new government moves toward the Allies. Hitler, furious at what he sees as betrayal and concerned about securing his southern flank before invading the Soviet Union, orders an immediate invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. The Balkans campaign is swift and brutal. Yugoslavia falls in 11 days. Greece falls in 3 weeks. Another demonstration of Wehrmacht superiority and blitzkrieg effectiveness. But it costs 5 weeks. 5 weeks that push Barbarossa's start date from May 15 to June 22, 1941. 5 weeks that will prove catastrophic when autumn arrives early and winter comes before Moscow falls. But in June, as over 3.8 million men assemble along the Soviet border, confidence is absolute. Officers study maps showing the route to Moscow, 1,000 kilometers through enemy territory. Soldiers write letters home, promising they'll be back by autumn in time for harvest festivals. Tank commanders check fuel levels and ammunition counts, making final adjustments to equipment. The largest invasion in history is ready. On the night of June 21, the final orders go out. At precisely 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa will begin with a massive artillery barrage along the entire front. In Moscow, Soviet border commanders send increasingly frantic reports to Stalin. Throughout June, German forces are masked at the frontier. Reconnaissance indicates imminent attack. Forward positions report hearing German tank engines. Stalin dismisses the reports. He's convinced Hitler won't attack. Not yet. Not while Britain still fights. These must be provocations meant to force the Soviet Union into a military response that would give Hitler justification for war. He orders his commanders not to take any action that might provoke the Germans. No full mobilization, no forward defensive positions, do not respond to provocations. At 3:14 a.m. on June 22, German artillery crews stand ready along the entire 1,800-mile front. Gunners have coordinates locked in. Forward observers check their watches, counting down the final seconds. At 3:15 a.m., the world changes forever. 3:15 a.m., 3,000 artillery pieces fire as one. The flash can be seen from space. A line of fire 1,800 m long, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The sound isn't just heard, it's felt. The ground trembles. Windows shatter in villages 40 kilometers from the border. Soviet guard posts vanish. Barracks explode. Communication stations are obliterated before a single warning can be sent. Entire towns along the frontier, Brest, Grodno, Countess, erupt in flames. At a Soviet observation post near the Bug River, Lieutenant Nikolai Pavlov is writing in his log when the world explodes. The bunker collapses. He crawls out through rubble, ears ringing. Bleeding from shrapnel wounds he doesn't yet feel. Outside, the forest is on fire. The sky is orange. He tries to reach headquarters on the field telephone. The line is dead. He tries the radio. Static. Then he hears them. Engines. Hundreds of engines growing louder. The panzers are coming. The bombardment lasts 90 minutes. When it stops, the silence lasts exactly 30 seconds. Then Panzer Group 2, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, 630 tanks strong, crashes through the Soviet lines south of Brest. Panzer Group 3, under General Hermann Hoth, 840 tanks, smashes through near Grodno to the north. They're not advancing in lines. They're driving in concentrated columns. Armored fists punching deep into Soviet territory. Panzer III ES and Ivars. Turrets traversing. Main guns firing at bunkers. Strong points. Anything that moves. Behind them. Motorized infantry in trucks and half-tracks. Behind them. Regular infantry divisions marching at forced pace. This is blitzkrieg at its peak. Speed, violence, shock. Above the Luftwaffe rules unchallenged at Soviet airfields across the border region. Aircraft sit parked in neat rows. Wings. Almost touching perfect targets. Pilots are asleep in barracks. Ground crews haven't been mobilized. No one received orders to disperse the planes or scramble fighters. Stuckers and Henkel bombers arrive at dawn. They don't face anti-aircraft fire. They don't face interceptors. They simply line up and drop their bombs. Soviet fighters and bombers explode on the ground. Fuel. Tanks ignite, turning entire airfields into firestorms. Pilots run onto the tarmac and watch helplessly as their aircraft burn. At one field near Minsk, Major Ivan Kopets, commander of the Soviet Western Front's bomber aviation, stands among the wreckage of his command. 48 hours later, he'll write a report to Moscow detailing the losses, then walk into his office and shoot himself. By the end of the first day, June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe destroys 1,200 Soviet aircraft. The actual number may be higher. Soviet records are chaotic. Incomplete. The Red Air Force loses air superiority in 24 hours. On the ground, chaos is total. At Western Front headquarters in Minsk, General Dmitry Pov receives reports that make no sense. Germans attacking at the border. Expected. Germans already 50 kilometers deep. Impossible. Germans reported simultaneously in 6 different sectors. How? Communications collapse. Radio nets are jammed or destroyed. Telephone lines are cut by artillery or by German special forces who cross the border hours before the invasion. Messengers are sent with orders and never return. Killed by air strikes or overrun by advancing panzers. Pavlov tries to reach Moscow. The line connects finally at 4:30 a.m. Defense Commissar Seaman Timoshenko answers. Pavlov reports the Germans have invaded in force across the entire front. Timoshenko's response. Do not panic. Do not give in to provocation. The matter is being reported to Comrade Stalin. Pavlov asks for permission to mobilize reserves and order a general retreat to prepare defensive lines. Timoshenko, wait for orders from Moscow. The call ends. Stalin doesn't issue coherent orders until 7:15 a.m. 4 hours after the invasion began. When they come, they're worse than useless. Soviet forces are ordered to attack the invading Germans and destroy enemy forces, but not cross the border. Commanders read the orders in disbelief. Attack with what? Half their units are encircled or destroyed. The rest have no air cover, no clear picture of where the enemy is. No supplies moving forward because the roads are clogged with refugees and burning vehicles. But orders are orders, especially Stalin's orders. Soviet counterattacks go forward. They're slaughtered. Near Grodno, the Soviet 6th Mechanized Corps, over 1,000 tanks, launches a counterattack against Hoth's Panzer Group 3. On paper, this should be devastating. The Soviets have numerical superiority, but the tanks are a mix of obsolete models and newer T-34s and KV-1s. That crews barely know how to operate. There's no reconnaissance, no air support, no coordination with infantry. They drive straight into German positions. German panzer FARs dug into hull-down positions on ridges fire down into the advancing Soviet armor. German 88 metal anti-aircraft guns repositioned as anti-tank weapons tear through Soviet tanks at 1000 m. Stuos dive from above, sirens screaming, dropping bombs directly onto tank columns. The Soviet 6th Mechanized Corps is annihilated in 3 days. Over 1,000 tanks destroyed or abandoned. The Corps ceases to exist as a fighting force. This pattern repeats across the front. Soviet units attack without coordination. German forces destroy them in detail. But not everywhere. At the fortress of Brest, right on the Bug River, the German 45th Infantry Division expects to take the position in hours. The fortress is old 19th century construction. Its garrison, approximately 9,000 Soviet troops, border guards, NKVD units, and some military families should surrender quickly. They don't. German infantry assaults the fortress walls under artillery cover. Soviet defenders fire from embrasures, from rooftops, from rubble. German flamethrower teams burn out bunkers. Soviet soldiers retreat to interior positions and keep fighting. The battle for Brest lasts a week. Room to room, floor to floor, bunker to bunker. German combat engineers have to blast through walls, collapse buildings. On defenders, use poison gas in the underground sections. The last Soviet defenders down to a handful of men with no ammunition, no water, no hope, scratch messages on the fortress walls. In the final days, I'm dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland. 74-41 July 20th, nearly a month after the invasion began. The soldier who wrote it, name unknown, was buried when the Germans dynamited his position. Brest is an exception, but it reveals something German intelligence didn't predict. These soldiers fight differently than the Poles or French. They don't quit. By June 28, 6 days into the invasion, Army Group Centers, 2 panzer groups, have driven over 300 kilometers into Soviet territory. Darians. Panzer Group 2, advancing from the south, takes the city of Slonim. Hoth's Panzer Group 3, driving from the north, captures Madino. Between them, the city of Minsk, and between the German border and Minsk, several entire Soviet armies. The 3rd, 4th, and 10th armies, over 400,000 men. On June 29, Guderian and Hoth spearheads link up east of Minsk. The trap closes. 400,000 Soviet soldiers are encircled. 15 rifle divisions, 6 tank divisions, elements of 4 mechanized corps, cut off from supply, no air support, no escape route. Soviet commanders order breakout attempts. Columns of men and vehicles try to smash through German lines at night. Some small groups succeed, slipping through in the chaos, vanishing into the forests. Most don't. German infantry divisions move up to seal the pocket. Artillery pounds Soviet positions. The Luftwaffe attacks anything that moves inside the encirclement. Soldiers run out of ammunition, then food, then water. By mid-July, the Minsk pocket is liquidated. German forces take over. 290,000 prisoners. Another 70,000 Soviet soldiers are dead. The rest escaped or are unaccounted for, likely dead in the forests or dying of wounds. It's the largest encirclement in military history. And German newsreels bring the images to the world. Endless columns of Soviet PS, hands raised, shuffling westward under guard. Captured Soviet tanks and artillery abandoned along roadsides. German soldiers posing in front of Red Army banners. The Soviet Union appears to be collapsing exactly as Hitler predicted. In the North, Army Group North smashes through Lithuania and Latvia. Riga falls on July 1st. By mid-July, German forces are approaching the outskirts of Leningrad, 900 kilometers from where they started. In the South, Army Group South advances more slowly. Soviet resistance is better organized there. The terrain, rivers, marshes, slows the painters, but it's still an advance. By early July, German forces are driving toward Kiev. The numbers by mid-July are staggering. Over 600,000 Soviet PS taken, over 1,500 Soviet aircraft destroyed, thousands of Soviet tanks and artillery pieces captured or destroyed. German forces penetrated 400 to 500 kilometers into Soviet territory. In Berlin, victory seems certain. Officers at OKH, Army High Command begin planning occupation zones and resource extraction. Hitler tells his inner circle that the Soviet state is finished. Stalin will either surrender or be overthrown by his own people. Propaganda Minister Isef Goebbels writes. In his diary, the Führer estimates the campaign will be over in 4 weeks. Everything is going according to plan. Except it isn't. The problems are small. At first, easy to dismiss in the flood of victories. Soviet units that should surrender fight until they're annihilated. Encircled forces break into small groups and continue fighting behind German lines, attacking supply convoys, ambushing messengers, sabotaging rail lines. This isn't how defeated armies behave. German supply units report increasing attacks from Soviet stragglers and partisans. A convoy is ambushed on the road to Minsk. 12 trucks burned, 34 soldiers killed. A fuel depot is blown up by Soviet demolition teams that slipped through the front. A German battalion commander is found dead on a road he thought was secure, shot by a sniper. The distances are starting to matter. German supply lines now stretch 300, 400, 500 kilometers from the railheads to the front. Soviet railways use a wider gauge than European railways. Every supply train stops at the border while engineers change the axles or transfer cargo to compatible rolling stock. The process takes hours, sometimes days. The roads are worse than intelligence predicted. Dirt tracks that turn to mud after summer rainstorms. Trucks bog down. Traffic jams form. A panzer division waiting for fuel can't advance. An infantry division waiting for ammunition can't attack. And the tanks are breaking. German panzers were designed for European roads and European distances. Russia has neither. Transmissions fail from overuse. Engines overheat. Tracks throw. Suspensions break on rough terrain. By mid-July, 30% of German armored vehicles are non-operational due to mechanical failure, not combat losses, breakdowns. Spare parts have to come from Germany. That's 1,500 kilometers away. And the Red Army isn't collapsing. Soviet forces are being destroyed in the border regions. Yes, but fresh divisions keep appearing. Pulled from the interior, mobilized from reserves, stripped from the Far East, where they had been watching the Japanese border, poorly trained, barely equipped, often thrown into battle. Within days of formation. But they're there. At Smolensk, 400 kilometers east of Minsk, the Soviets establish a new defensive line in mid-July. Army Group Center attacks. Another encirclement forms. 300,000 more Soviet troops trapped. But this time, the pocket doesn't collapse quickly. Soviet forces inside launch breakout attempts. Soviet forces outside launch relief attacks. The fighting drags on. Days become weeks. German officers expected Smolensk to fall in a week. It takes 2 months to fully reduce the pocket. 2 months while Moscow fortifies. 2 months while Soviet factories evacuate east beyond German reach. 2 months while autumn approaches. Hitler's generals see the problem. They urge him, drive for Moscow now. Smolensk is 400 kilometers from the capital. The road is open. Strike before the Soviets can dig in. But Hitler makes a different calculation. One that will decide the fate of the entire campaign. August 4, 1941. Wolf's Lair. East Prussia, Hitler's field headquarters. The map room is tense. Franz Helder, chief of the Army General Staff, stands at the map table pointing to Moscow. Around him, Field Marshal Walter von Brauch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army. General Heinz Guderian. Panzer Group 2, other senior commanders summoned from the front. They've come to convince Hitler of one thing. Drive for Moscow. Now Holder lays out the argument. Army Group Center is 400 kilometers from Moscow. The road from Smolensk to the capital is open. Soviet defenses between here and Moscow are weak, hastily constructed, undermanned. The panzers can reach the city in 3 weeks, 4 at most. Moscow isn't just a city. It's the nerve center of the entire Soviet state. Stalin's government is there. The railway hub connecting the entire Western Soviet Union runs through it. Soviets' command and control depends on Moscow's communication networks. 7 major rail lines converge there. Take Moscow and the Soviet Union is decapitated. The state might collapse. At minimum, Soviet ability to coordinate resistance across the front dies. Autumn is 8 weeks away, maybe less. Every day wasted is a day closer to mud, rain, cold. Strike now. Hitler listens. He's been listening to this argument for 2 weeks. From Holder, from Brock, from Bach, commander of Army Group Center, who sent increasingly urgent messages from the front. When Holder finishes, Hitler shakes his head. Moscow can wait. He points to the map. South Ukraine. Here. He says, this is what matters. Ukraine holds the resources Germany needs for a long war. The industrial capacity of the Donbass region, the coal mines, the grain fields that feed the Soviet Union, the oil fields further south in the Caucasus. More immediately, a massive Soviet force over 600,000 men is concentrated around Kiev, threatening Army Group South's flank. Hitler's decision is strategic and ideological. Germany needs Ukraine's resources. The Soviet forces at Kiev must be destroyed. Only then can the Wehrmacht drive for Moscow with secure flanks. His generals argue back carefully because contradicting Hitler is dangerous. Guderian speaks. My Führer, we can take Moscow before the weather changes. Once Moscow falls, Kiev will be isolated anyway. The Soviet forces there will collapse. Hitler cuts him off. The Soviet forces at Kiev will not collapse. They will attack Army Group South's flank while we're driving for Moscow. We'll be fighting a 2-front battle in the center while winter approaches. Holder tries again. Moscow is the strategic objective. Everything else is secondary. Hitler's voice hardens. I will not have my southern flank threatened. The panzers turn south, destroy the Soviet forces at Kiev. Then, and only then, we advance on Moscow. The meeting ends. Darian leaves the room, knowing the campaign has just been lost. He doesn't say it, not yet. But he writes in his diary that night, "This is the decision that will cost us the war in the East." On August 21st, Panzer Groups 2 and 3, the armored spearheads of Army Group Center, receive their orders. Turn south. Drive for Kiev. The Kiev encirclement is a tactical masterpiece. Darian's Panzer Group 2 drives south from Smolensk. Panzer Group 1 from Army Group South commanded by General Auld von Kleist drives north from the Dnieper River. On September 14th, they link up east of Kiev. The pocket contains 665,000 Soviet soldiers. The southwestern front, 5 entire armies, is trapped. Soviet commanders inside the pocket beg Moscow for permission to retreat before the encirclement closes. Marshal Seaman Bodioni, commanding the southwestern direction, sends desperate messages to Stalin. "We must withdraw, or the front will be annihilated." Stalin's response, "Hold KF, not one step back." On September 11th, 3 days before the pocket closes, the Soviet Chief of Staff in the Kiev sector, General Mikhail Konos, receives orders directly from Stalin. "Encirclement is not possible. You will hold your positions." Konos obeys. He's a loyal officer. He holds. On September 16th, with German forces tightening the noose, Konos finally receives permission to attempt to break out. It's too late. His forces are surrounded out of ammunition, being hammered by German artillery and air strikes. Kirpos is killed on September 20th, trying to break through German lines, shot by a machine gun burst. His body is found days later. By September 26th, the Kiev pocket is eliminated. 665,000 Soviet prisoners, the largest encirclement in military history. Thousands more dead in the fighting. Mountains of captured equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, supplies. German news reels show the scale of the victory. Columns of Soviet PS stretching to the horizon. Captured Soviet generals being interrogated. Hitler's decision appears vindicated. But look at the calendar. The Kiev operation began on August 21st. It ended on September 26th. 5 weeks. 5 weeks while Army Group Center sat idle at Smolensk, waiting for its panzers to return. 5 weeks while Moscow, fortified, Soviet workers, men, women, teenagers dug anti-tank ditches around the capital. 3 defensive lines stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Trenches, bunkers, minefields. 5 weeks while Stalin mobilized more divisions from Siberia and Central Asia. 5 weeks while autumn approached. When Darian's panzers returned to Army Group Center in late September, ready to resume the drive on Moscow, the window has narrowed to a crack. Autumn rains are due in early October. That means Rasputa, the season of mud. Once the mud comes, movement becomes nearly impossible. The ground has to freeze before armored operations can resume. That gives the Wehrmacht maybe 3 weeks to reach Moscow. For if they're lucky, the generals know it. Some say it openly. This can't be done. Not in the time remaining. Not with the forces available. Not with supply lines already stretched to breaking. But Hitler orders the attack anyway. Operation Typhoon. The final drive on Moscow. Launch date: October 2nd, 1941. Army Group Center assembles the largest concentration of force the Wehrmacht has ever fielded in a single operation. 78 divisions, 1 million men. Fagans 700. Tanks, 14,000 guns, 1,000 aircraft. 3 panzer groups will strike simultaneously, encircling Soviet forces west of Moscow in one final decisive Kessellicht. The plan is brilliant on paper. In execution, it starts well. October 2nd, the offensive begins. German panzers smash through Soviet defensive lines in multiple sectors. Within days, 2 massive encirclements form. One at Vyazma, one at Bryansk. Trapped inside, 673,000 Soviet soldiers. German forward units race east. By October 10th, advanced reconnaissance elements are within 80 kilometers of Moscow. The capital seems within reach. In Moscow, panic sets. Government ministries evacuate east to Kyiv, 900 kilometers away. Foreign diplomats flee. Railway stations are mobbed by civilians desperate to escape. Looting breaks out in some districts. NKVD troops restore order by shooting looters in the streets. For 3 days, it looks like Moscow will fall. Then, on October 7th, the sky opens. Rain, not drizzle, not showers. Torrential freezing rain that falls for days without stopping. The dirt roads of Western Russia, the same roads German supply columns and panzer divisions have been using for 4 months, turn to liquid mud. Not the mud of Europe. This is something else. Glutinous. Bottomless. Vehicles don't get stuck, they disappear. Trucks sink. To their axles, then to their doors. Tanks bog down, treads spinning. Uselessly. Horses collapse trying to pull wagons through the muck. A single truck getting stuck blocks entire convoys. Traffic jams stretch for kilometers. Infantry trying to march. Forward sinks knee-deep with every step, exhausting themselves, covering a few 100 meters. The offensive doesn't slow, it stops. German soldiers stand in freezing rain, watching their vehicles sink into the earth, unable to move forward or back. Supply convoys that should take 6 hours to reach the front take 3 days or don't arrive at all, stuck somewhere on roads that have become rivers of mud. Fuel doesn't reach the panzers. Ammunition doesn't reach the artillery. Food doesn't reach the infantry, and the Soviets use the pores. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, pulled from the Leningrad front, takes command of Moscow's defense on October 10th. He's 44 years old, blunt, ruthless, and competent. He organizes worker battalions to dig more anti-tank ditches. He positions what remains of the Soviet Western Front's forces into 3 defensive lines west of Moscow. He brings Siberian divisions west, troops trained and equipped for winter, wearing quilted jackets and felt boots. He tells his officers, "We hold until the ground freezes, then we make them pay for every meter." By early November, the mud begins to freeze. The temperature drops first to 0, then below. The ground hardens. Movement becomes possible again. The German advance resumes on November 15th. But now the soldiers are facing something else. Winter. No winter clothing was issued. Not because of oversight, because the plan said the campaign would be over by October. The Wehrmacht would be in winter quarters. Moscow, Leningrad, Ukraine before the cold came. But it's November. The campaign isn't over. And German soldiers are still wearing the same uniforms they crossed the border in 5 months ago. When the temperature drops to 20 degrees Celsius in mid-November, the suffering is immediate. Soldiers wrap themselves in anything they can find. Stolen Soviet coats, blankets, newspapers stuffed under uniforms for insulation. It's not enough. Frostbite appears within days. Fingers turn white, then gray, then black. Toes the same. Ears, noses. Men lose extremities to cold, not combat. The equipment fails. Tank engines won't start. The oil freezes solid overnight. Soldiers build fires under the engines to warm them, sometimes setting the entire tank ablaze. Machine guns freeze. After a few rounds, rifle bolts become too stiff to operate. Soldiers urinate on their weapons to thaw the mechanisms. German soldiers watch Soviet troops moving in winter gear and functioning equipment, and they realize the enemy is ready for this. We're not. But the advance continues. Because Hitler's orders are clear. Take Moscow. By late November, German forces reach the closest point they'll ever get to the Soviet capital. Advanced units of the 258th Infantry Division reach Kimi, a town 15 kilometers from the Kremlin. German officers can see Moscow's anti-aircraft searchlights sweeping the night sky. Through binoculars, they can see the spires of the capital. So close, but they can't advance further. They're out of fuel, out of ammunition, freezing, starving, exhausted. And on December 5, 1941, the Soviets counterattack. December 5, 1941. 3. Abazim 40 kilometers west of Moscow. Oberleutnant Isef Deck, 106th Infantry Division is trying to sleep in a destroyed Russian farmhouse when he hears it. Artillery distant at first, then closer. Hundreds of guns. The sound rolling across the frozen landscape like continuous thunder. He's been on the Eastern Front since June. He knows what Soviet artillery sounds like. But this is different. This is heavier than anything he's heard since the campaign began. Then he hears something else. Engines. Tank engines. Dozens of them growing louder. He stumbles outside into 35 degrees. Darkness. Other soldiers are emerging from buildings, from foxholes, from wherever they'd found shelter from the cold. Someone shouts, "The Russians are attacking." Deck looks east. The horizon is lit with muzzle flashes. Hundreds of them. The Soviets aren't supposed to attack. They're supposed to be finished, broken, clinging to Moscow, waiting for the final German assault. But they're attacking. 100 Soviet divisions over 1 million men launch simultaneous assaults along a 600 kilometers front around Moscow. These aren't the half-trained, poorly equipped conscripts the Wehrmacht has been fighting. These are Siberian divisions pulled from the Far East. Troops who've been training in conditions worse than this. Wearing proper winter uniforms, quilted jackets, fur-lined boots, white camouflage smocks, equipped with weapons that function in extreme cold. They've been moving into position for 2 weeks while German reconnaissance, blinded by snow and lacking fuel for patrols, missed them. Now they strike. T-34 tanks, their wide tracks gripping frozen ground where German panzers are immobilized, smash through German defensive positions. Soviet ski troops moving through forests impossible to German vehicles appear behind German lines, cutting supply routes, overrunning headquarters. Kazakh cavalry charges hit exposed German flanks. The Wehrmacht has never seen anything like this. At Kinnanen, north of Moscow, the Soviet 31st Army breaks through German lines and drives 50 kilometers in 3 days. Tula, south of the capital, Soviet forces encircle German units that had been preparing to complete the encirclement of Moscow. The hunter becomes the hunted. The German defensive response is chaos. Units that have been attacking for 5 months, always advancing, always on the offensive, suddenly have to defend. But defend what? Defend where? The front line is fluid. Soviet breakthrough groups are everywhere. Officers try to organize defensive positions, but the frozen ground is too hard to dig. Entrenching tools bounce off earth that's frozen solid as concrete. Soldiers pile snow and corpses to build firing positions. And the cold is killing as surely as Soviet bullets. By early December, nighttime temperatures are dropping to 40 degrees Celsius. Daytime temperatures barely reach 30 degrees. German soldiers are still wearing summer uniforms with whatever they've scavenged layered on top. It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. Men die in their sleep. Their body heat drops during the night. Hypothermia sets in and they never wake up. Centuries freeze to death at their posts. Found standing upright. Rifles in hand. Frozen solid. Frostbite becomes epidemic. Not minor cases. Catastrophic tissue death. Fingers, toes, feet, hands turn black and die. Field hospitals are overwhelmed with frostbite casualties. Surgeons amputate frozen limbs without anesthesia because supplies ran out weeks ago. The screaming can be heard across entire encampments. More men are being evacuated for frostbite than for combat wounds. And the equipment is failing completely. Tanks won't start. Soldiers light fires under the engines, trying to warm the oil enough to flow. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the tank catches fire and burns. Sometimes the engine is so cold that starting it cracks the engine block. Vehicle batteries die in the cold. Radios don't work. Machine guns fire 3 rounds and jam. Mortars shatter when fired. The metal brittle from extreme cold. German soldiers watch Soviet equipment function normally and realize the truth. The enemy is built for this war. We're not. By December 10th, the Wehrmacht is retreating along the entire front around Moscow. Not an orderly withdrawal, a rout. Units disintegrate. Officers lose contact with their men. Soldiers flee westward in small groups trying to stay ahead of Soviet pursuit. They abandon equipment they can't move. Vehicles, artillery, supplies. Entire convoys are left on the roads, frozen solid, out of fuel. The roads west become nightmares. Columns of retreating Germans mix with supply convoys trying to move forward. Traffic jams form that stretch for dozens of kilometers. Soviet aircraft strafe the jams. Soviet artillery shells them. Men abandon vehicles and flee into the forests. Thousands freeze to death. During the retreat, they fall behind the column, exhausted, frostbitten, sick, and collapse in the snow. If their comrades try to help them, they both die. So they leave them. The roads west are lined with frozen corpses. At Army Group Center headquarters, Field Marshal Fedorov Batch watches his front collapse and sends increasingly desperate reports to Hitler. The 4th Panzer Group has been pushed back 100 kilometers in 5 days. The 9th Army is in full retreat. The 2nd Panzer Army, Darian's command, is being encircled south of Moscow. Soviet forces have recaptured Kienan, Klint, Istra. They're driving toward Kuga and Smolensk. Boch requests permission for a general withdrawal to defensible positions 150 kilometers west. Shorten the lines. Consolidate. Survive the winter and resume operations in spring. Hitler's response arrives on December 16th. Stand fast. No retreat. Every position will be held. The order is read with disbelief at field headquarters. Hold what? German forces are scattered across hundreds of kilometers of Russian winter. Supply lines don't exist. Units are surrounded. Men are freezing. Darian, whose 2nd Panzer Army is being systematically destroyed, requests permission to withdraw to the Oker River line 50 kilometers back where defensive positions can be established. Hitler refuses. Darian flies to East Prussia on December 20th to argue in person. The meeting is brief and brutal. Darian, my Führer, my men are dying of cold faster than they're dying in combat. We must withdraw to positions we can hold. Hitler, the army will hold its current positions. Withdrawal is forbidden. Darian, then the army will be destroyed. Hitler, better destroyed in place than destroyed retreating. Guderian returns to the front. On December 26th, he's relieved of command for continuing to argue for withdrawal. Field Marshal Walter von Bracich, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, suffers a heart attack on December 19th. Stress, exhaustion, the weight of watching the Wehrmacht bleed out in the snow. Hitler accepts his resignation and assumes personal command of the army. Now, Hitler is making tactical decisions from East Prussia about positions 1,500 kilometers away that he can't see and doesn't understand. But in a strange, terrible way, the Standfast order works, not because it's militarily sound, because it prevents total collapse. German units that might have fled in panic are forced to hold improvised positions. They dig into villages, into forests, into anywhere that provides shelter from the wind. They fight not to advance or even to win, but simply to survive until spring. Soviet offensives driving deep into German positions create their own supply problems. Soviet units outrun their logistics just as the Wehrmacht did in summer. Soviet tank spearheads run out of fuel. Soviet infantry advances in 40 tidal fork cold, suffering their own frostbite casualties. The Soviet offensives slow then stop. Not because German defenses are strong, but because both sides are exhausted. By late December, the front stabilizes. The Wehrmacht has been pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow, depending on the sector. The closest they'll ever get to the Soviet capital is now in the past. The cost is catastrophic. Army Group centers. Casualties in December alone. Over 160,000 men killed, wounded, missing, incapacitated by frostbite. But that's just December. That's just one army group across the entire Eastern Front. By the end of 1941, Wehrmacht casualties exceed 830,000 men. Approximately 250,000 dead, over 500,000 wounded, many permanently disabled, 50,000 plus missing or captured. Tens of thousands more incapacitated by frostbite so severe they'll never fight again. The 3.8 million men who crossed the Soviet border in June have been reduced by nearly 1 million casualties in 6 months. Equipment losses are equally devastating. 2,300 pleased tanks destroyed or abandoned. Over 60% of the invasion force, thousands of aircraft lost. 190,000 plus vehicles destroyed or inoperable. Over half the horses, the Wehrmacht's primary logistics system. Dead German formations are shells of their former strength. Divisions that began the campaign with 17,000 men now field 4,000 to 6,000. Some units have ceased to exist entirely, amalgamated with other shattered formations. And the Soviets, despite horrific losses, over 4.4 million casualties in 1941, are mobilizing more divisions. Factories evacuated east beyond German reach are producing tanks, aircraft, artillery. The war that was supposed to be over in 10 weeks has become a grinding war of attrition, and Germany is losing. In villages across the Reich, the first letters arrive in late December and early January. We regret to inform you that your son, husband, brother, father has fallen in the East, missing in action, died of wounds. The German people were told the campaign was a success, that Moscow would fall, that the Bolshevik state was finished. Now the casualty lists are coming home. Small towns that sent 200 men east receive notices that 80 won't return. Families wait for letters that will never come. Women become widows. Children become orphans. Parents bury sons when there's a body to bury. Most of the dead are still in Russia, frozen in snow drifts, buried in mass graves, lying in fields and forests where they fell. The largest invasion in history has turned into the largest military disaster Germany has experienced since the 30 Years' War. And it's only the beginning. The Eastern Front will continue for another 3.5 years. Stalingrad Kursk, Operation Barbarossa, the slow, grinding Soviet advance that will end in Berlin in 1945. But the turning point isn't Stalingrad in 1942. It's here, December 1941, when the Wehrmacht was stopped at the gates of Moscow and thrown back for the first time. The myth of German invincibility died in the Russian winter, and with it died any chance Germany had of winning the war. Here's what most people believe about Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union with the largest army ever assembled. They advanced successfully through summer and autumn. Then winter arrived. Early, brutal, unprecedented, and the German army, unprepared for the extreme cold, froze to death in the Russian snow. If not for the unusually harsh winter, Germany would have won. This narrative is comfortable. It removes human responsibility. It makes the disaster seem like an act of nature. Unavoidable, unforeseeable, tragic, but blameless. It's also a lie told by German generals after the war to excuse their failure. A lie repeated so often it became accepted history. The truth is harder, more damning, and far more important to understand. The winter didn't defeat the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht defeated itself. Let's dismantle the myth piece by piece. Myth. The winter of 1941 was unusually severe. Reality. It was a normal Russian winter. Meteorological records from 1941 to 42 show temperatures within normal ranges. For the Moscow region, November temperatures power to 15 decors. December 15th decor. January 1942 20 to 38 December. This wasn't unusual. This was average. Moscow sees temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius every winter. The countryside gets colder. This has been true for centuries. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, he faced similar temperatures. When Charles V of Sweden invaded in 178, the same. The Russians knew what their winters were like. The Germans should have known. The Wehrmacht experienced the cold as catastrophic, not because it was unusual, but because German soldiers had never experienced a continental winter. Most came from temperate Western Europe, France, the Rhineland, Bavaria, where winter means 0 degree cars and rain, not 30 degrees and weeks of darkness. For Russians, this was normal. For Siberians, this was mild. The difference wasn't the weather. It was preparation. Soviet soldiers wore quilted jackets, fur-lined boots, wool gloves, fur hats. Their equipment was winterized. Engines designed to start in extreme cold, lubricants that didn't freeze, weapons that functioned at 40 miles. German soldiers wore summer uniforms with whatever they could scavenge. Their equipment failed because it wasn't designed for these conditions. That's not unusual weather. That's failure to prepare for predictable conditions. Myth. The Germans were caught by surprise. Winter came early. Reality. Winter came exactly on schedule. The campaign started late and ran long. The original plan called for invasion on May 15, 1941. That would have given the Wehrmacht 5 months of good weather, May through September, to destroy the Red Army and take Moscow before autumn. But the Balkans campaign delayed the start to June 22. That cost 5 weeks. Then the Kiev decision in August cost another 5 weeks. While Army Group Center's panzers were diverted south, Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, didn't begin until October 2. That's 4.5 months after the invasion started. The plan said Moscow would fall by late August. In reality, German forces didn't even begin the final assault until October. This wasn't winter arriving early. This was the campaign running catastrophically behind schedule. Every decision that delayed the advance, the Balkans, Kiev, the 2-month battle at Smolensk, pushed the timeline closer to winter. And every German planner knew winter was coming. They gambled. They'd win before it arrived. They lost the gamble. Myth: if Germany had issued winter clothing, they would have won. Reality: winter clothing wouldn't have fixed the fundamental problems. Yes, the lack of winter equipment was a catastrophic oversight. Thousands of men died or were incapacitated by frostbite that proper clothing would have prevented. But the Wehrmacht's problems went far deeper than uniforms. The logistics system had collapsed by midsummer, long before winter. German supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers from railheads to the front. Soviet railways used a different gauge, forcing transfer of all supplies. At the border, roads were primitive dirt tracks that turned to mud after rain. The Wehrmacht needed to move 900 tons of supplies per day just to maintain basic operations for Army Group Center alone. By November, they were moving less than half that. Fuel didn't reach the panzers. Ammunition didn't reach the artillery. Food didn't reach the infantry. Winter clothing, even if it had been issued, wouldn't have solved the fact that there was no logistical infrastructure capable of sustaining 3.8 million men 1,000 plus km into enemy territory. The plan required the war to be over. Before logistics became a critical problem, when the war wasn't over, the system collapsed. Winter just made it visible. Myth: the Wehrmacht was winning until winter stopped them. Reality: the Wehrmacht was losing by August. Look at the numbers. By the end of August 1941, still summer temperatures in the 20 Quran, the Wehrmacht had suffered over 440,000 casualties. That's before the mud, before the cold, before Moscow. Over 400,000 men lost in 10 weeks. Not from freezing, from combat, disease, exhaustion, and the sheer grinding attrition of fighting an enemy that wouldn't quit. German armored strength had declined by 50% due to mechanical breakdowns, not combat losses. Breakdowns from operating on terrible roads across vast distances. The invasion began with 3,600 tanks. By September, fewer than 1,800 were operational. Horses, the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics, were dying by the thousands from overwork and lack of fodder. By autumn, over 100,000 horses were dead. Summer heat and overwork killed them, not winter cold. The Red Army, despite losing millions of men, was still forming new divisions. Soviet factories were being evacuated east beyond German reach and continuing production. The campaign was already failing before the first snow fell. Winter didn't create the crisis. It revealed it. The real reasons Barbarossa failed. First, the logistics were impossible from day one. An army of 3.8 million men cannot be sustained 1,000 kilometers from its supply base across territory. With primitive infrastructure, the math never worked. German quarter masters knew it. They were told victory would come so quickly it wouldn't matter. It mattered. Second, the timeline was fantasy. 8 to 10 weeks to destroy the Red Army and occupy European Russia was never achievable. It was based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse like France. Quick, decisive, total. But the Soviet Union wasn't France. It was deeper, larger, more populous, more resilient. Soviet forces could retreat 500 kilometers and still have strategic depth. France couldn't. The assumption of quick collapse was ideology masquerading as strategy. Third, the enemy was catastrophically underestimated. Every German intelligence assessment was wrong. Soviet tank production wasn't inferior. By 1941, the T-34 was superior to any German tank in armor, mobility, and firepower. Soviet industrial capacity wasn't limited. The USSR outproduced Germany in tanks and aircraft throughout the war. Soviet will to resist wasn't weak. When faced with a war of extermination, the Soviet population fought with desperation. German intelligence saw what ideology told them to see. Slavs were inferior. Communism was fragile. Victory was inevitable. Reality disagreed. Fourth, the ideology was toxic. This wasn't a conventional war. This was a race war, an ideological war of annihilation. Wehrmacht orders called for the execution of Soviet commissars. The abuse of PS, the destruction of Jewish Bolshevism. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were massacred. Ukrainians and Belarusians who might have welcomed the Germans as liberators from Stalin instead encountered Einsatz group death, squads and starvation policies. Potential allies became partisans. Soviet soldiers knowing they faced execution or death by starvation if captured. 3.3 million Soviet PS would die in German custody fought to the death rather than surrender. The ideology guaranteed the war would be total and merciless. That benefited the defender, not the attacker. Fifth, winter was the context, not the cause. Yes, winter killed tens of thousands of German soldiers. Yes, equipment failed in the cold. Yes, the Wehrmacht was unprepared. But Soviet soldiers and equipment functioned in the same winter. The T-34 tanks moved. The Siberian divisions fought. The Red Army counteract while German forces froze. The difference was preparation, adaptation, and fighting on home ground. Winter didn't defeat Germany. Germany defeated itself by launching an unwinnable campaign based on ideology, continuing it past the point of viability, and refusing to adapt when reality contradicted the plan. Stop here. For a moment. Think about how many times you've seen this pattern. Leaders who believe ideology over evidence. Militaries convinced that will and superior technology can overcome logistics and geography. Campaigns launched on assumptions that are never tested. Enemies underestimated because they're viewed through contempt rather than analysis. Vietnam, Soviet Afghanistan, American Afghanistan, Iraq. The specifics change. The pattern holds. When you ignore logistics, underestimate your enemy, and believe your own propaganda, people die. Not hundreds. Hundreds of thousands. Drop a comment. Where else do you see this pattern today? What modern parallels come to mind? And if this video is changing how you see history, if you're realizing the comfortable myths you learned in school were lies, hit subscribe because we're not done. Every video on dark history classes breaks down the myths and shows you what actually happened. The 830,000 Wehrmacht casualties by the end of 1941 didn't die because of weather. They died because of decisions made by leaders who couldn't accept that reality doesn't bend to ideology. And they're still teaching us if we're willing to listen. The failure at Moscow in December 1941 didn't end the war. It guaranteed Germany couldn't win it. Everything that came after 3.5 more years of fighting, millions more dead, entire cities reduced to rubble was consequence flowing from those first 6 months. The moment the Wehrmacht failed to take Moscow before winter, the strategic equation changed permanently. Germany was now fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with more men, more resources, and more territory than it could ever match. But Hitler couldn't accept that. Wouldn't accept it. So the killing continued. 1940 The drive for oil. By spring 1942 the Wehrmacht had rebuilt barely divisions. Shattered in the winter were refilled with new conscripts. Equipment losses were replaced though never fully. The Eastern Front stabilized along a line running from Leningrad in the north through Moscow's outskirts down to Rostov in the south. German casualties from the entire 1941 campaign over 830,000 men, 1 million if you include sick and permanently disabled. Soviet casualties, over 4.4 million, killed, captured, wounded, missing. By every metric, The Soviets had suffered worse, but they were still fighting, still mobilizing. Factories evacuated beyond. The Urals were producing thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler planned a new offensive for summer 1942. Case Blue. Not Moscow this time. The Caucasus. The oil fields at Baku that fueled the Soviet war machine. Capture the oil and the Red Army grinds to a halt. The offensive began in June. Initially, it succeeded. German forces drove deep into southern Russia, reaching the Caucasus Mountains by August. But Hitler made the same mistake again. Divided objectives. He ordered the 6th Army commanded by General Friedrich Pauwes to capture the city of Stalingrad on the Vula River. Not for strategic reasons, for symbolic ones. The city bore Stalin's name. Taking it would be a propaganda victory. Pauwes's 6th Army reached Stalingrad in August and entered the city in September. The battle became hell. Urban combat, house to house, room to room, floor to floor. Soviet defenders commanded by General Vasily Chukov contested every building, every street, every pile of rubble. German soldiers called it Ratengrieg, rat war. Fighting. In the sewers, in bombed-out factories, in the wreckage of apartment buildings. A sniper war. A grenade war. Combatants. So close they could hear each other breathing through walls. The 6th Army bled itself out, taking 90% of the city. By November, Pauwes reported his army was exhausted, out of ammunition, and needed to withdraw to regroup. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets answered. 2. Massive pincer attacks, Operation Uranus, struck north and south of Stalingrad, smashing through Romanian and Italian forces, protecting the German flanks. On November 23, the pincers met west of the city. The entire 6th Army, 290,000 men, was encircled. Hitler ordered Pauwes to hold. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring promised to supply the army by air, 500 tons per day. The Luftwaffe delivered less than 100 tons per day. It wasn't enough. Through December and January, the 6th Army slowly starved and froze inside the Stalingrad pocket. Soviet forces tightened the noose. German relief attempts failed. On January 31, 1943, Pauwes surrendered. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal the day before. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Pauwes surrendered. Anyway, of the 290,000 men trapped at Stalingrad, only 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. The rest died in the pocket or in Soviet captivity. Stalingrad was the first time an entire German army had been destroyed. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility already cracked at Moscow shattered completely. 1943, the last offensive Germany tried. One more time. Summer 1943, Operation Citadel, a massive pincer attack against a Soviet salient bulging into German lines near the city of Kursk. If successful, it would encircle over 500,000 Soviet troops and potentially regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht assembled the largest armored force it had ever fielded. 2,700 tanks and assault guns. New models. Panther tanks, Tiger tanks, Ferdinand tank destroyers, the best equipment German industry could produce. The attack began July 5, 1943. The Soviets were waiting. Soviet intelligence, warned by the British, who had broken German codes, knew exactly when and where the attack would come. The Red Army dug in. 8 defensive lines stretching back 150 kilometers, minefields, anti-tank ditches, concealed anti-tank guns, artillery pre-sighted unlikely. German approach routes. The Battle of Kursk lasted 2 weeks. It was the largest tank battle in history. At Prokhorovka on July 12, over 800 tanks fought in a Single engagement across 30 kilometers. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse of burning armor. By July 13, the German offensive had stalled. Gains measured in kilom, losses measured in hundreds of irreplaceable tanks. Hitler called off the offensive on July 13. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had launched a major offensive and failed to achieve a breakthrough. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviets. From Kursk onward, Germany was retreating. 1944–1945, the long retreat. Soviet offensives in 1944 drove the Wehrmacht out of the Soviet Union entirely. Operation Barbarossa in June 1944, timed to coincide with D-Day in the West, destroyed German Army Group Center. 28 German divisions ceased to exist. Over 450,000 German casualties in 5 weeks. Soviet forces liberated Belarus, the Baltic states, Poland. By January 1945, the Red Army was on German soil. The advance toward Berlin was brutal. Soviet soldiers, remembering what the Wehrmacht had done to their country, showed little mercy. German civilians fled west by the millions ahead of the Soviet advance. By April 1945, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issued orders to armies that no longer existed, directed counteroffensives by divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier, blamed his generals for losing a war he had made unwinnable. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet forces blocks away, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The cost. The Eastern Front was the deadliest theater of the deadliest war in human history. German casualties on the Eastern Front, over 4 million military deaths. Another 1 million missing or captured and who never returned. That's 80% of all German military deaths in World War II. Soviet casualties, 8.7 million military deaths. 18+ million civilian deaths. Read that again. 27 million Soviet citizens died. That's the population of modern-day Australia. Gone. Entire cities were erased. Leningrad lost 1/3 of its population to starvation during the siege. Kiev, Minsk, Stalingrad reduced to ruins. Over 1,600 Soviet towns and 70,000 villages destroyed completely. The demographic impact was catastrophic. The Soviet Union lost an entire generation. In some regions, the ratio of women to men was 3.1 after the war. Millions of children grew up without fathers. Families ceased to exist. And it began with the decisions made in Berlin in December 1940. The belief that ideology could overcome logistics, that will could defeat geography, that the enemy would break because German racial theory said they must. 830,000 Wehrmacht casualties in the first 6 months. 4 million more in the 3.5 years that followed. All of it. Every death, every ruined city, every shattered family. Consequence flowing from a plan that was doomed before the first shot was fired. What it means. The bones are still being found. Construction crews in Russia, Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states uncover mass graves with horrifying regularity. German helmets corroded into rust. Soviet rifles still loaded. Identification tags that let families finally learn what happened to sons and brothers who vanished in 1941 and never came home. Museums preserve letters found on bodies. A Wehrmacht soldier writing that he can't feel his feet anymore. A Soviet conscript telling his mother he's being sent to the front without a rifle. A German officer's diary admitting what they're doing to civilians is monstrous, but he follows orders anyway. These weren't statistics. They were human beings. The 800 or even 30,000 Wehrmacht casualties by the end of 1941 were sons who wrote letters home promising they'd be back by Christmas. Husbands who kissed their wives goodbye at train stations in June and never returned. Fathers whose children waited for them. The 4.4 million Soviet casualties were farmers pulled from fields, factory workers, conscripted with days of training, teenagers who lied about their age to fight, women who served as pilots and snipers and tank drivers, all of them dead or broken because leaders chose ideology over reality. That's the lesson. Not don't invade Russia in winter. The lesson is when you ignore logistics, underestimate your enemy, and believe your own propaganda. When you launch wars based on ideology instead of strategy, people die. Not hundreds, millions. And the pattern repeats because we keep telling ourselves comfortable lies instead of hard truths. We say Germany lost because of winter, not because the plan was impossible. We say the Wehrmacht was defeated by superior numbers, not because they launched a war of annihilation that turned potential allies into enemies. We say Hitler's mistakes cost Germany victory, not that the entire premise that Germany could conquer and hold the Soviet Union was fantasy from day one. The comfortable lies let us avoid confronting the real lesson. Wars built on ideology rather than strategy are doomed. Leaders who believe their own propaganda destroy the people who trust them. Campaigns launched without logistics, without realistic timelines, without understanding the enemy fail. And the human cost is incalculable. Operation Barbarossa is still teaching. The question is whether we're listening. If this story changed how you see history, if you're walking away understanding not just what happened, but why it matters, do something with that. Share this video. Let someone else learn what you just learned. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. What hit you hardest? What parallels do you see today? And subscribe to Dark History Class. Because we're not here to tell you comfortable stories. We're here to tell you true ones. The 27 million Soviet citizens and 4 million German soldiers who died on the Eastern Front deserve more than myths. They deserve to be remembered honestly. And we deserve to learn from their deaths so we don't repeat the mistakes that killed them. The ghosts of 1941 are still speaking. Will we listen?